Imagine a boy who never completed a single year of formal schooling, yet grew up to become the most celebrated scientist of his age. Picture a teenage runaway fleeing his apprenticeship with nothing but the clothes on his back, who would one day dine with kings and philosophers in the grandest courts of Europe. Consider a colonial tradesman, a man who spent his youth covered in printer's ink, who would help bring into existence a nation that did not even exist when he was born. This is the story of Benjamin Franklin. His life is in many ways the American story before America itself existed. It is a story of relentless self-invention, of a mind so curious it could not rest, of a man who seemed to contain multitudes. He was a printer, a writer, a scientist, a diplomat, an inventor, a philosopher, and a revolutionary. He tamed lightning and helped topple an empire. Before we begin this journey, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Settle in, let the noise of the modern world fade away, and let us travel back nearly 3 centuries to a world of candle-lit rooms and sailing ships, of quill pens and printing presses, of colonies clinging to the edge of a vast unknown continent. Tonight we followed the man who built himself from nothing and helped build a nation from scratch. To understand Benjamin Franklin, you must understand the weight of his genealogy. He often joked that he was the youngest son of a youngest son for 5 generations back, which in the early 1700s meant he was born into a position of absolute nothingness. In the strict social hierarchy of the time, the oldest sons inherited the wealth and the land, while the youngest sons were left with the scraps of the world. Benjamin was born in 1706 in a tiny house on Milk Street in Boston, directly across from a church that seemed to watch his every move. His father, Josiah, was a tallow chandler, a man who spent his life surrounded by the stench of boiling animal fat to make candles and soap. The house was a chaotic swarm of 17 children, and Benjamin grew up in a world where privacy did not exist, and every mouthful of bread had to be earned. He was originally intended to be a gift to the church, a child sacrificed to the ministry. But the church's coldness and his father's poverty soon closed that door, leaving the boy to face a world that had no plans for him. History books tell you Franklin loved reading, but they rarely tell you the dangerous lengths he went to for a single page of text, because his father pulled him from school at 10. Benjamin's education became a series of midnight thefts. He would make friends with the apprentices of booksellers, convincing them to let him borrow books from the shop at night. He would run home, read the entire volume by the flickering light of a single tallow candle, and return the book before the shop opened at dawn so the owner would never know. He once became a vegetarian, not for health or animals, but because it allowed him to save the money his father gave him for meat so he could buy more books. He was a boy obsessed with the technology of thought, deconstructing the essays of the Spectator and rewriting them from memory to master the art of persuasion. He realized early on that in a world of kings and lords, the only weapon a poor boy had was the ability to think and write better than the men who owned the world. At 12 years old, Benjamin was legally bound as an apprentice to his older brother James, a man with a printing press and a volatile temper. In those days, an apprentice was not a student. He was a servant, almost a slave. James was a pioneer of colonial journalism, but he was also a harsh master who did not hesitate to use his belt or his fists to discipline his younger brother. Benjamin lived in a state of constant physical and mental tension, working from before sunrise until long after dark in a shop that smelled of lead and ink. He was the printer's devil, the lowliest worker who performed the dirtiest tasks. Yet even as he was being beaten, he was observing how James used the press to challenge the Boston authorities. He saw the power of the printed word to stir up trouble and demand change. And he began to realize that, if he could master the press, he could eventually escape the brother who held him captive. The scars on his back were the price he paid for the knowledge of how to start a revolution. The first great deception of Franklin's life happened in 1722. When he was just 16, James refused to let Benjamin write for his newspaper. So the boy invented a persona that fooled the entire city of Boston. He created Silence Doggett, a middle-aged widow from the country who had a sharp wit and a tongue like a razor. He wrote the letters in a disguised hand and slipped them under the door of the print shop at night. The letters became a sensation, mocking the pretensions of the Boston elite and the hypocrisy of the local clergy. James and his friends would sit around the shop praising the brilliance of this mysterious widow, never suspecting that the boy cleaning the floors was the one mocking them all. Silence Doggett was the first evidence of Franklin's genius for masks. He understood that people would listen to a fictional widow far more than they would listen to a teenage apprentice. When he finally confessed the truth, the fame he received was so great that it drove a permanent wedge of jealousy between him and his brother, a rift that would eventually lead to a midnight escape in September of 1723. Benjamin Franklin committed a crime that could have seen him imprisoned. He broke his legal indenture and ran away. He lied to a ship captain, claiming he had gotten a girl pregnant and needed to flee the city to avoid a forced marriage. This lie allowed him to board a ship bound for New York, and eventually he found his way to Philadelphia. He arrived on a Sunday morning, exhausted, dirty, and down to his last few coins. His pockets were stuffed with dirty stockings, and he walked up Market Street with 3 enormous puffy bread rolls, one under each arm and one in his mouth, as he passed the house of a man named Reed. A 17-year-old girl named Deborah stood in the doorway and laughed at the sight of this ridiculous, rumpled stranger. She had no idea that she was looking at her future husband, or that this boy with the bread rolls was carrying the seeds of a new empire in his head. He was a fugitive and a nobody, but he was finally free from the leather belt of his brother, and the world was about to find out exactly what a younger son could do. In 1724, a young and hungry Franklin was lured across the ocean by the empty promises of Sir William Keith, the governor of Pennsylvania. Keith was a man of immense charm but shallow character who enjoyed cultivating promising young men, and he made Franklin a proposal that seemed to be the shortcut to his dreams. The governor promised to help set Benjamin up with his own printing shop, claiming that Philadelphia needed a printer of his caliber. He urged Franklin to sail to London to purchase the finest press and type, promising that letters of credit and introduction would be waiting for him in England to cover every expense. Franklin, 18 years old and full of hope, believed the word of a royal official and crossed the Atlantic, leaving behind a promise of marriage to Deborah Reed. But when he stepped onto the foggy docks of London, he discovered a devastating truth. The letters did not exist. Keith had lied. A man who made grand promises to everyone but delivered to no one. Franklin found himself stranded in the largest city in the world with almost no money and no way home. But he did not break. He found work at the famous printing houses of London, demonstrating his speed and precision that amazed the English masters. He survived by his skills, learning the rhythms of a global metropolis and observing the sophisticated intellectual life of European coffee houses. He returned to Philadelphia 18 months later, having lost his naivety but gained a wisdom that no colonial education could provide. He vowed never again to rely on the empty promises of powerful men. realizing that independence was a fortress he had to build for himself. While working in the massive London print shops, Franklin encountered a culture of heavy drinking that shocked his practical sensibilities. His fellow pressmen believed that they needed to drink 5 or 6 pints of beer a day, just to have the strength to pull the heavy wooden screws of the presses. Franklin, who preferred water and bread, was mocked as the water American. They believed he would be weak. But he soon proved them wrong by carrying 2 heavy forms of lead type up and down the stairs while they struggled with one. He realized that the clarity of a sober mind was his greatest competitive advantage. He began to organize the shop's finances and even negotiated better terms for the workers, showing the first signs of the leadership that would one day organize a revolution. He spent his nights reading and writing, saving every penny to buy his passage back to America, while his colleagues spent their wages at the alehouse. This period solidified his belief that discipline and frugality were the only true paths to freedom, and he began to formulate the systematic approach to life that would later become his famous 13 virtues. In 1726, Franklin finally found a way home. Hired as a clerk by a kind Quaker merchant named Thomas Denham, he spent the long voyage writing a plan for his future life. A set of rules he called his plan of conduct to ensure he would never be poor or stranded again. He was determined to reinvent himself as a respectable businessman, leaving behind the rebellious identity of the runaway apprentice. But tragedy struck shortly after they arrived in Philadelphia. Denham, his mentor and protector, fell ill and died. Franklin was once again unemployed and adrift. He was forced to return to the printing trade, working for a man named Samuel Keene, a strange and disorganized character who Franklin secretly planned to surpass. This period of his life was a masterclass in patience. He was sharpening his tools in the shadows, waiting for the exact moment to strike out on his own and claim the city for himself. He learned the importance of reputation, making sure that everyone in Philadelphia saw him as the hardest working man in the colony. Franklin knew that a man without family connections could only rise by building a network of like-minded allies. In 1727, he gathered 11 of his most ambitious friends, surveyors, shoemakers, and printers, to form a secret club called the Junto. They were the leather apron men, the working-class thinkers who were ignored by the wealthy elite. They met every Friday night in a tavern to discuss philosophy, morals, and politics. But the Junto was more than a debate club. It was an intelligence network. Members would report on who was failing in business, who was succeeding, and what new opportunities were opening in the colony. This secret society was Franklin's private university and his most powerful political tool, allowing him to plant ideas in the minds of others and watch them grow into reality. He understood that to change a city, you must first build a small and dedicated core of people who share your vision, and the Junto became the invisible engine behind every civic project he would later launch. By 1729, Franklin had successfully maneuvered to buy a failing newspaper called the Pennsylvania Gazette. Most colonial papers were dull lists of shipping news and official proclamations. But Franklin turned the Gazette into a masterpiece of engagement. He wrote anonymous letters to himself, created fake controversies to stir up debate, and used his sharp wit to mock the local government without ever being caught. He was the first to realize that a newspaper should not just inform, but entertain and provoke. He also pioneered the use of advertising, making the paper so profitable that it gave him the financial independence he had craved since his days in the candle shop. He was now 23 years old, the master of his own press, and the most influential voice in the city. His success was built on a deep understanding of human nature, knowing that people would pay for a paper that made them laugh, think, and feel like they were part of a larger conversation about their own future. In 1730, Franklin faced a crisis that could have ruined his growing reputation. As a young man with a rising business, he was expected to marry into a respectable family, but he was haunted by his past treatment of Deborah Reed, whom he had abandoned years before when he sailed for London. Deborah had since married a man named John Rogers, who turned out to be a criminal and a bigamist before disappearing to the West Indies. This left Deborah in a legal nightmare. She was not truly a widow and not truly free, making a formal marriage to Franklin impossible under the strict laws of the time. Yet Franklin chose to take her back in a common law marriage, a move that was scandalous to many in pious Philadelphia. Around the same time, Franklin acknowledged a son named William, born out of wedlock to a mother whose identity he took to his grave. Deborah, in a remarkable act of partnership, agreed to raise William as her own alongside their future children. This complicated family dynamic was the secret foundation of his home, proving that Franklin was willing to defy social norms to protect those he had wronged, and to take responsibility for his own mistakes. In 1732, Franklin launched a project that would make him the most famous author in the American colonies. He created the persona of Richard Saunders, a humble and slightly henpecked stargazer who published Poor Richard's Almanac. In an age before mass media, the almanac was the most important book in any household, providing weather forecasts and market dates. But Franklin filled the margins with witty proverbs that taught the virtues of hard work and thrift. Phrases like early to bed and early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise became the soundtrack of American life. He understood that to educate the masses, he had to entertain them first, using humor to deliver a serious message about self-reliance. The almanac was a massive commercial success, selling 10,000 copies a year and providing Franklin with the wealth he needed to stop working for money and start working for humanity. He was no longer just a printer, he was becoming a brand, a symbol of the possibilities of the new world. Franklin realized that the members of his Junto Club were hungry for knowledge, but too poor to buy the expensive books being imported from London. In 1731, he proposed a revolutionary idea: a subscription library where members would pool their money to purchase a collective collection of books. This became the Library Company of Philadelphia, the first of its kind in North America. Franklin himself served as the first librarian, often working behind the desk to organize the volumes and encourage young tradesmen to read. He believed that a democracy could only function if its citizens were well informed, and he saw the library as a fountain of knowledge that would wash away the ignorance of the provincial colonies. This project was the birth of the American public library system, a testament to Franklin's belief that access to information was a fundamental right rather than a privilege of the elite. He was building the intellectual infrastructure of a nation decades before that nation was even born. Philadelphia in the 1730s was a city of wooden houses and narrow streets, where a single spark could lead to total destruction. Franklin watched as disorganized crowds would rush to fires and often cause more damage than the flames themselves. In 1736, he organized the Union Fire Company, the first volunteer fire brigade in the city. He required every member to provide their own leather buckets and bags for salvaging goods, and he established a system of training that turned firefighting into a disciplined profession. He wrote articles in his newspaper explaining how to handle hot coals and clean chimneys, realizing that prevention was more effective than any cure. His fire company became a social and civic model that spread throughout the colonies, proving that ordinary citizens could organize themselves to protect their community without waiting for the permission or the funding of a distant king. In 1740, Franklin turned his inventive mind toward a problem that affected every colonial family during the bitter winters. Traditional fireplaces were incredibly inefficient, wasting most of the heat up the chimney and filling rooms with dangerous smoke. He designed a metal-lined fireplace known as the Franklin stove, which used an inverted siphon to trap and circulate heat more effectively. This invention saved wood and kept families warmer. But what was most remarkable was Franklin's refusal to patent it. When the governor of Pennsylvania offered him a lucrative monopoly on the design, Franklin declined, stating that as we enjoy great advantages from the inventions of others, we should be glad of an opportunity to serve others by any invention of ours. He believed that knowledge and technology belonged to the public, an early example of the open-source philosophy that would define his scientific career. He was a man who measured his success not by the gold in his pocket, but by the number of lives he had made easier through the power of reason. By his early 40s, Franklin had achieved enough financial security to retire from the daily grind of the printing shop and dedicate himself to the study of the natural world. In 1743, he witnessed a demonstration of electrical sparks that ignited a curiosity he could not quench. He began to transform his home into a laboratory, rubbing glass tubes and charging Leyden jars until his fingers were numbed by constant shocks. While other scientists in Europe believed electricity was two different fluids, Franklin proposed a revolutionary theory of a single fluid that could be positive or negative. He was the first to realize that electricity could not be created or destroyed, only transferred from one object to another, a concept now known as the conservation of charge. He spent his nights surrounded by strange glowing globes and crackling wires, driven by a hunger to understand the invisible forces that governed the universe. And his discoveries were about to turn the provincial American printer into a household name in the halls of science. In 1752, Franklin performed the most audacious and dangerous experiment of his life, hoping to prove that lightning was not a divine punishment, but a massive electrical discharge. He stood in a field outside Philadelphia during a violent thunderstorm, accompanied only by his son William. Together, they launched a silk kite into the heart of the storm with a sharp metal wire at the top to attract the electrical charge. At the bottom of the hemp string hung a simple metal key, and Franklin held a silk ribbon to insulate himself from a lethal strike as the rain soaked the string. He noticed the loose fibers of the hemp standing on end as if they were alive. When he brought his knuckle close to the key, a sharp spark jumped across the gap, proving for the first time in human history that the lightning of the heavens was the same substance as the sparks in his laboratory. He had touched the fire of the gods and survived, and the news of his triumph spread across the Atlantic like a wildfire, earning him the title of the modern Prometheus. Franklin was never content with pure theory, and he immediately sought a way to turn his discovery into a practical tool for human safety. He realized that if lightning was attracted to metal, a pointed iron rod placed on the highest point of a building could draw the electrical charge from the clouds and carry it safely into the ground through a wire. Before this invention, lightning was a constant terror that frequently burned down churches and homes in a matter of minutes. The lightning rod was a physical manifestation of the Enlightenment, the idea that through reason and observation, humanity could master the elements and reduce the suffering caused by natural disasters. He refused to patent the device, wanting it to be used freely to protect every house and barn. And soon his pointed conductors began to rise above the steeples of Philadelphia and the palaces of Europe. He had transformed a terrifying mystery into a manageable force, proving that the mind of man was a match for the power of the storm. In 1754, as the shadow of war with France loomed over the colonies, Franklin arrived at a meeting in Albany, New York, with a radical vision for the future. He realized that 13 individual colonies, each acting in its own narrow interest, were too weak to defend themselves or negotiate with Native American nations. He proposed a unified colonial government with a central council and a president general, an idea that was decades ahead of its time. To promote his plan, he published what is now considered the first political cartoon in American history. A woodcut of a snake cut into 8 pieces with the caption, "Join or Die." Although the plan was rejected by both the colonies and the British Crown, it planted the first seeds of the idea of an American Union. Franklin saw that the colonies could only survive if they stopped seeing themselves as separate entities and started seeing themselves as a single people. A realization that would eventually lead him to the center of a revolution by 1753. The boy who had cut wicks in a candle shop was receiving the highest honors of the scientific world. The Royal Society of London awarded Franklin the Copley Medal, the 18th century equivalent of the Nobel Prize, for his curious experiments and observations on electricity. He was the first American to receive such international recognition, and it placed him on the same level as giants like Isaac Newton. Universities began to shower him with honorary degrees, and he was soon addressed everywhere as Dr. Franklin. His scientific celebrity gave him a level of political influence that few other colonists could dream of. As the British government began to take notice of the brilliant Philadelphian, who seemed to understand the secrets of nature better than their own professors, he was no longer just a local leader, he was a citizen of the world, and his fame was about to become his most powerful diplomatic weapon in the fight for a nation that was yet to be born. In 1757, the Pennsylvania Assembly grew tired of the stubbornness of the Penn family, who owned the colony as a private estate and refused to allow their vast lands to be taxed for the common defense. The Assembly chose Franklin to sail to England as their agent, tasking him with a mission to convince the proprietors to contribute their fair share to the costs of the French and Indian War. Franklin arrived in London to find a city that was the beating heart of a global empire, and he initially enjoyed the sophisticated social life of the capital. He took lodgings in a house on Craven Street and began to move through the highest circles of British society. But he soon discovered that the Penns were arrogant and dismissive of the rights of the colonists, viewing Pennsylvania as a personal kingdom rather than a society of free men. This dispute was Franklin's first deep exposure to the rigid class structures of Britain, and it began to sour his view of the men who sat in the seats of power across the ocean. During a break from his tense negotiations in London, Franklin traveled north to Scotland in 1759, where he found an intellectual home among the greatest minds of the Enlightenment. He was welcomed as a peer by the philosopher David Hume and the economist Adam Smith, who admired his practical approach to science and government. The University of St. Andrews granted him an honorary doctorate, and Franklin found the atmosphere of Edinburgh to be the most intellectually stimulating of his life. These thinkers believed in the perfectibility of human society through reason, an idea that resonated deeply with Franklin's own experiences as a self-taught man. He returned to London with a renewed sense of purpose and a deeper understanding of the natural rights of man. But he also realized the contrast between the brilliance of the Scottish philosophers and the narrow-mindedness of the British politicians, who were struggling to manage their growing empire. In 1765, the British Parliament passed the Stamp Act, a direct tax on almost every piece of printed paper used in the colonies. From legal documents to playing cards, Franklin, still in London, initially misjudged the intensity of the American reaction. He even recommended a friend for the post of stamp distributor in Philadelphia. But back home, the colonies were in a state of open rebellion, and his own house was threatened by angry mobs who viewed him as a traitor. Franklin realized his mistake and immediately threw himself into a campaign to repeal the act, writing articles and meeting with members of Parliament to explain that the colonists would never accept taxation without representation. He understood that the Stamp Act was not just about money. It was about the fundamental right of a people to govern themselves through their own elected assemblies. The crisis reached its peak in February of 1766, when Franklin was called to testify before the House of Commons. For 4 grueling hours, he stood before the British legislators, answering over 170 questions with a calm and devastating logic that left his questioners stunned. He explained that the Americans were once a people who loved Britain, but that the Stamp Act had broken their trust and was driving them toward resistance. He warned Parliament that if they tried to enforce the tax with an army, they would find no one to govern but a desert. His testimony was a masterpiece of political persuasion, and it led directly to the repeal of the Stamp Act shortly after. Franklin was celebrated as a hero in America, having faced down the power of the empire and won. But the underlying disagreement over who had the ultimate authority to tax the colonies remained a ticking time bomb. By 1772, Franklin still hoped that the rift between Britain and the colonies could be healed. But he came into possession of a secret packet of letters written by Thomas Hutchinson, the royal governor of Massachusetts. These letters revealed that the governor had been secretly encouraging the British government to use harsher measures against his own people, writing that there must be an abridgment of what are called English liberties in the colonies. Franklin, hoping to shift the blame for the conflict onto the governor rather than the British government itself, sent the letters to a small circle of leaders in Boston with strict instructions for privacy. But the letters were leaked and published, causing a massive scandal that made Hutchinson the most hated man in America. The British government was humiliated by the exposure of their governor's private thoughts, and they turned their fury on Franklin, accusing him of being a thief and a spy who had violated the sanctity of private correspondence to stir up a rebellion. On the 29th of January, 1774, Franklin was summoned to appear before the Privy Council in a room in London known as the Cockpit. The atmosphere was thick with hostility, as 36 of the most powerful men in the British Empire gathered to watch the public destruction of the famous American. The Solicitor General, Alexander Wedderburn, unleashed a 60-minute torrent of vicious personal abuse, calling Franklin a man of 3 letters, thief, and accusing him of being the master of a secret conspiracy to destroy the colony's relationship with the Crown. Franklin stood motionless the entire time, his face a mask of stone, wearing a suit of spotted Manchester velvet, as the lords in the gallery laughed and cheered at every insult. He was being publicly humiliated by the very empire he had served for decades. And as he stood there in silence, his loyalty to King George III finally died. replaced by a cold and absolute determination to see America free in March of 1775. Franklin boarded a ship to return to a home he had not seen in years. He was 69 years old and racked with the pain of gout. Yet he refused to let his mind idle during the 6-week voyage across the Atlantic. He spent his days lowering thermometers into the ocean, recording the water temperature at different depths to map the warm current known as the Gulf Stream. He realized that by understanding this hidden river in the ocean, ships could significantly shorten their journey to Europe, a discovery that would change navigation forever. But as the ship drew closer to the American coast, the scientific curiosity was overshadowed by a heavy dread. He was returning to a wife who had died in his absence and a son who remained a loyal servant of the British Crown. When he finally stepped onto the wharves of Philadelphia, he learned that the war had already begun at Lexington and Concord, and the self-made man of the world was now officially a man of war. The day after he arrived, Franklin was elected to the Second Continental Congress. Finding himself among younger and more aggressive men who were eager for a fight, he was the elder statesman of the room, a silent but powerful presence who rarely made long speeches but whose wisdom was sought on every committee. He was tasked with organizing the first American postal system and designing the defenses of Philadelphia, but his most unusual contribution was born of desperation. Knowing that the colonies had almost no gunpowder or muskets, he seriously proposed that American soldiers should be armed with bows and arrows or long pikes. He argued that a man could fire 4 arrows in the time it took to load a single musket, and that the sight of falling arrows would terrify the British regulars, while Congress chose firearms. Franklin's willingness to look back to ancient weapons showed his commitment to winning the Revolution by any means necessary. In June of 1776, Congress appointed a committee of 5 to draft a formal Declaration of Independence, and though Thomas Jefferson wrote the first draft, it was Franklin who provided the most critical editorial change in history. Jefferson had originally written that we hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable. But Franklin, the man of science and reason, took his pen and changed the words to self-evident. He wanted the rights of man to be seen not as a religious mystery, but as a logical fact, as undeniable as the laws of physics. He sat with a frustrated Jefferson during the long days of debate, telling him humorous stories to soothe his ego as Congress cut away large portions of the text. When it finally came time to sign the document in August, Franklin famously warned his fellow delegates that they must all hang together, or they would most assuredly all hang separately. By October of 1776, the Revolution was failing. The Continental Army was in retreat, and the Congress knew that, without help from a major European power, the cause was lost. They turned once again to the 70-year-old Franklin, asking him to cross the Atlantic in the middle of winter to secure an alliance with King Louis XVI of France. It was a suicide mission. The Atlantic was crawling with British warships that would have gladly hanged him as a traitor, and the winter storms were brutal on his failing health. Franklin suffered through the crossing in a small and leaky ship, arriving on the coast of France so weak he had to be carried to his carriage. But he understood that he was carrying the survival of his country in his luggage. He was about to step onto the world's most glamorous stage to play the final and most important role of his life. When Franklin arrived in Paris in December of 1776, he knew he could not compete with the silk and gold of the French court. So he chose to play a different role entirely. He abandoned the powdered wigs and elaborate costumes of a diplomat and appeared in public, wearing a simple brown suit and a marten fur cap. He presented himself as the natural philosopher from the American wilderness, a man of rustic wisdom and republican simplicity who embodied the ideals of the Enlightenment. The French aristocrats, who were bored with their own decadence, fell instantly in love with this image of the noble savage with a genius mind. His face began to appear on snuff-boxes' rings, and even the walls of peasant cottages, and women styled their hair in the coiffure à la Franklin. He understood that to win the king's support, he first had to win the hearts of the French people, turning himself into a global brand that made the American cause the most fashionable movement in Europe. While Franklin was being celebrated in the salons, he was secretly meeting with the French foreign minister, the Comte de Vergennes, in a dangerous game of high-stakes espionage. France was not yet ready to openly join the war, fearing a British retaliation if the Americans lost. But Franklin managed to secure a secret flow of gold, weapons, and gunpowder that kept Washington's army alive during the darkest days of the Revolution. He operated out of a grand house in the village of Passy, which was filled with spies from every nation in Europe. He knew that his every letter was being read and his every movement tracked by British agents. Yet he maintained a calm and affable exterior, using his charm to keep the French interested and the British guessing. He was a master of the slow game, waiting for a single American victory that would prove to King Louis XVI that the rebellion was a winning investment. The news that Franklin had been waiting for finally arrived in Paris in December of 1777. A messenger rode through the gates of his house in Passy to deliver the incredible report that an entire British army under General Burgoyne had surrendered to the Americans at Saratoga. Franklin moved with lightning speed, using the news to pressure the French government into a formal alliance before they could change their minds. He warned Vergennes that if France did not act immediately, Britain might offer the Americans a peace deal that would reunite the empire. The gamble worked, and the King of France realized that this was his chance to deal a death blow to his ancient rival. Saratoga was the military victory, but it was Franklin's diplomatic maneuvering that turned a battlefield success into a global superpower alliance. On the 6th of February, 1778, Franklin achieved the impossible. He sat in a room at the Hotel de Crillon and signed the Treaty of Alliance, which formally brought France into the war as an ally of the United States. For the ceremony, he wore the same suit of spotted Manchester velvet that he had worn during his humiliation in the cockpit trial 4 years earlier. It was a silent and powerful act of revenge, proving that the man the British had mocked was now the man who had secured their defeat. A few weeks later, he was officially presented to King Louis XVI at Versailles, standing in the Palace of Mirrors without a wig or a sword, a simple American printer among the most powerful monarchs on earth. He had secured the gold, the ships, and the soldiers that would eventually win the war, and he had done it through the sheer force of his own reputation. Despite his age and his massive workload, Franklin found time for a social life that scandalized his more puritanical American colleagues like John Adams. He became a regular at the salons of powerful and intelligent women, most notably Madame Brillian and Madame Helvetius. He exchanged hundreds of letters with them, filled with wit, philosophy, and playful declarations of love. He sat for hours in their gardens, playing chess and discussing the future of humanity, while some saw this as a sign of an old man's vanity. Franklin understood that in the French court, the real power was often held by the women who influenced the king's ministers. These friendships were both an emotional refuge and a diplomatic tool, allowing him to stay connected to the heart of French power, while maintaining the charm that made him the most beloved man in Paris. In 1781, the long years of diplomatic maneuvering in Paris finally bore fruit on the muddy shores of Virginia. Franklin had secured the massive loans that paid for the Continental Army and, most importantly, the deployment of the French Navy under Admiral de Grasse. When the British General Cornwallis found himself trapped at Yorktown, it was the French fleet that blocked his escape by sea, and it was French soldiers who fought alongside George Washington's troops to force the final surrender. When the news reached Franklin in Passy, he knew his mission had been a success. He had taken a desperate rebellion and turned it into a global war that Britain could no longer afford to fight. Yet he did not celebrate with arrogance. He knew that winning a war was only half the battle, and that the struggle to win a favorable peace would require even more cunning than the alliance itself. Even as the world was being redrawn by his diplomacy, Franklin's restless mind continued to solve the small, practical problems of daily life. He was now in his late 70s and found it exhausting to constantly switch between two pairs of glasses, one for reading and one for looking at the distant French countryside in 1784. He took the lenses from both pairs, cut them in half, and joined them together in a single frame, creating the first bifocals. He wrote to a friend that this invention allowed him to see both the food on his plate and the faces of his dinner companions, a perfect metaphor for a man who always kept one eye on the immediate details and the other on the distant horizon of history. He also spent his time in Paris investigating the mysterious claims of Franz Mesmer and his animal magnetism, using scientific rigor to debunk what he saw as a fraud, proving that even as an old man, he was still the world's most formidable detective of truth. The negotiations to end the war were a grueling three-way game between the Americans, the British, and the French. Franklin, joined by John Adams and John Jay, had to navigate a minefield of secret agendas and shifting loyalties. While the French wanted to keep the young United States weak and dependent, Franklin secretly negotiated with the British to secure a massive territory stretching all the way to the Mississippi River. On the 3rd of September, 1783, he signed the Treaty of Paris, formally recognizing the United States as an independent nation. It was his last great act as a diplomat, and it was a masterpiece of leverage. He had used the threat of a continued war and the promise of future trade to win more land for America than any army could have conquered. The boy who had once run away from his brother's shop had now redrawn the map of the world. In 1783, while the peace was being finalized, Franklin stood in the crowds of Paris to watch the first human flights in hot air balloons designed by the Montgolfier brothers, as the massive, painted silk globe rose into the air. A skeptic in the crowd mocked the spectacle, asking what possible use such a toy could have. Franklin famously replied, "What is the use of a newborn baby?" He saw in the balloon the seeds of a future where travel and warfare would be revolutionized, imagining a time when an army of 5,000 men could be dropped behind enemy lines from the sky. While others saw a curiosity, Franklin saw a new era of human possibility. His mind, even as it neared its end, remained open to the wonders of the future, always searching for the next great spark that would move humanity forward. In 1785, after nearly a decade in France, the 79-year-old Franklin finally received permission to return home. His departure from Passy was like a funeral for a living saint, as thousands of French citizens lined the streets to see him off. He was in such pain from kidney stones that he had to travel to the coast in a litter provided by Queen Marie Antoinette herself. When his ship finally arrived in Philadelphia in September, the city erupted in joy. Bells rang, cannons fired, and a massive crowd followed his sedan chair to the house he had built but never lived in. He was the most famous man in the world, returning to a country that he had helped to create. Yet he knew his work was not yet finished. The nation was struggling under a weak government, and the old sage was about to be called back into the arena one last time. In 1787, the United States was a nation on the brink of collapse, as the Articles of Confederation had created a government too weak to tax, too weak to defend its borders, and too weak to settle the bitter disputes between the states. Franklin, now 81 years old and in constant physical agony from a large kidney stone, was elected as a delegate to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. He was so frail that he could no longer walk the short distance to the State House and was instead carried through the streets in a silk-lined sedan chair by 4 prisoners from the local jail. His presence was not about his energy, but his gravity, as he was the only man in the room with the international stature to rival George Washington. He sat in the sweltering heat of the assembly room, a quiet observer of the heated arguments, knowing that if this gathering failed, the country he had spent his life building would vanish before it had truly begun. The convention was nearly destroyed by a deadlock between the large states, who wanted representation based on population, and the small states, who demanded equal power. The arguments became so vicious that delegates threatened to leave and return home to prepare for civil war. Franklin, sensing the looming disaster, rose to speak. Or rather, he had his speeches read by a colleague because his own voice was too weak. He proposed the idea of a bicameral legislature, where the people would be represented in the House and the states would be represented equally in the Senate. This became known as the Great Compromise. Franklin understood that in a democracy, no one can get everything they want, and he used his legendary wit to remind the delegates that when a joiner wants to fit 2 boards together, he must sometimes thin both edges. He was the glue that held the fractured convention together, proving that the art of the deal was as much about humility as it was about intellect. On the 17th of September, 1787, the final draft of the Constitution was ready for signing, but several delegates were still deeply unhappy with the document. Franklin rose once more to deliver his final great speech, confessing that there were several parts of the Constitution he did not approve of, but adding that the older he grew, the more he doubted his own judgment. He urged every member to doubt a little of their own infallibility and to sign the document for the sake of the nation's survival. As the last delegates moved forward to put their names to the parchment, Franklin looked at the back of Washington's chair, which featured a carved half-sun. He remarked to those nearby that painters had often found it difficult to distinguish a rising sun from a setting one. But now, at last, he had the happiness to know that it was a rising sun. He had signed the Declaration, the Alliance, the Peace Treaty, and now the Constitution, completing the most remarkable political fourfold path in history. In the final year of his life, Franklin turned his attention to a debt that the Constitution had failed to pay: the existence of slavery in a land of liberty, although he had owned slaves in his younger years. His time in Europe and his scientific belief in the unity of nature had made him an ardent abolitionist. In February of 1790, he signed a formal petition as president of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, urging Congress to restore liberty to those who were still kept in chains. The petition sparked a furious debate in the House of Representatives, with Southern congressmen attacking Franklin's character and his age. Franklin responded with his last piece of writing, a brilliant and biting satire that used a fictional Islamic pirate to mock the Southern arguments for slavery. Even on his deathbed, he was using his pen as a weapon, refusing to let the nation he created ignore the hypocrisy of its founding. By April of 1790, Franklin's long journey was coming to its end as a lung infection turned into a painful abscess that made every breath a struggle. He was bedridden in his house on Market Street, surrounded by his daughter Sarah and his grandsons, whom he had mentored with the same care he had once given to the G. When a doctor suggested he sit up to breathe better, Franklin famously whispered that a dying man can do nothing easy. Yet he faced the end with the same curiosity he had shown in the field with his kite, viewing the transition of death as just another mystery of the natural world. On the night of the 17th of April, at the age of 84, the spark that had tamed the lightning finally went out, leaving behind a city in mourning and a world that felt suddenly darker without the light of its most brilliant citizen. When the news of Franklin's death reached the people of Philadelphia, the city fell into a silence that was eventually broken by the tolling of every church bell in the colony. On the day of his funeral, an estimated 20,000 people gathered to follow his coffin to Christ Church Cemetery, which was nearly half the population of the city at the time. The procession included everyone from the highest government officials to the lowest leather-apron tradesmen, the sailors from the harbor, and the students of the academy he had founded in France. The National Assembly declared 3 days of public mourning, the first time in history that a foreign nation had officially honored a private citizen in such a way. He was buried under a simple marble slab alongside his wife Deborah, as he had requested, leaving behind a city that felt like an orphan without its most famous father. Franklin's final testament was as unique and forward-thinking as the man himself, as he left behind a massive fortune not just to his family, but to the cities of Boston and Philadelphia in a way that would last for 2 centuries. He bequeathed £1,000 sterling to each city with the instruction that the money be lent out at low interest to young married tradesmen to help them start their own businesses. He calculated that through the power of compound interest, which he called the stone that turns lead into gold, the money would grow into millions over the next 200 years. He was literally investing in the future of the American worker from beyond the grave, and true to his calculations, the trusts eventually funded schools and technical institutes that still exist today, proving that even in death, Franklin was still the master of financial discipline and civic improvement today. The most common way people encounter Benjamin Franklin is on the face of the $100 bill, making him the only non-president besides Alexander Hamilton to be featured on major American currency. This choice was not accidental, as Franklin was the first American to write a serious treatise on the necessity of paper currency and the way it could fuel a growing economy. His face on the 100 is a nod to his role as the patron saint of American thrift and business, a man who believed that money was a tool for progress rather than just a symbol of status. Yet there is a hidden irony in his placement on the most valuable bill. As the man who preached about saving every penny and living with frugality has become the face of global wealth, he remains the symbol of the American dream. The boy from the tallow vats, who turned himself into a gold standard for the world, years before he died. Franklin wrote a famous epitaph for himself that compared his physical body to the cover of an old book, its contents torn out and stripped of its lettering and gilding. He wrote that he expected to appear once more in a new and more elegant edition, revised and corrected by the author. This metaphor captured his lifelong obsession with the printing press and his belief in the constant possibility of self-improvement. He did not view life as a fixed fate, but as a manuscript that could always be edited and made better. Although the original epitaph was not used on his actual gravestone, it remains the ultimate summary of his character, a man who was always looking for the next error to fix, the next theory to test, and the next way to make his story more useful to the world. Nearly 2.5 centuries after his death, the shadow of Benjamin Franklin is longer than ever, stretching across every part of modern life, from the bifocals on our faces to the lightning rods on our roofs and the libraries in our towns. He was the first American because he was the first to define what it meant to be a citizen of a republic, someone who takes personal responsibility for the success of their community. He proved that a single curious mind, armed with nothing but reason and hard work, could change the course of human history and topple empires without ever holding a sword. He remains a man of the people, the relatable founder who understood the value of $1 and the power of a laugh, as long as people strive to improve themselves and their world. The spirit of the boy who ran away from Boston will continue to guide the rising sun of the nation he helped to build. When Franklin was living in London as a colonial agent, he turned his townhouse at 7 Craven Street into a hidden center for scientific inquiry. While the neighbors thought he was merely a politician, he was actually conducting strange acoustic experiments that led to the invention of the glass harmonica. He took a series of nested glass bowls of varying sizes and tuned them by adding water, then mounted them on a rotating spindle operated by a foot pedal. When he touched the spinning rims with moistened fingers, the instrument produced a haunting, ethereal sound that mesmerized audiences across Europe. Mozart and Beethoven were so captivated by the celestial music that they composed original pieces for it. But the instrument soon gained a dark reputation, as some musicians claimed the high-frequency vibrations drove them insane or caused nervous disorders. Franklin ignored the superstitions, playing the harmonica for his friends late into the night, proving that even in the middle of a political storm, he could find harmony in the laws of physics. Franklin was an obsessed chess player who saw the game as a perfect training ground for the mind, believing it taught foresight, circumspection, and caution. In Paris, he would spend hours at the Café de la Régence, the headquarters of European chess, playing against the best minds of the age. He once famously played a marathon match against the Duchess of Bourbon while he was soaking in his bathtub, refusing to leave the water until the game was decided. But for Franklin, chess was never just a game. It was a diplomatic tool. He used the quiet hours over the board to observe the temperaments of his rivals, learning who was prone to rash moves and who was paralyzed by fear. He understood that a man's true character is revealed when he is under pressure on the 64 squares, and he won many political concessions not across a boardroom table, but across a chessboard where his opponents never realized they were being outmaneuvered until it was too late. During his 9 years in France, Franklin's home in the village of Passy was one of the most dangerous places in the world. It was crawling with British spies, French informants, and double agents who were all trying to steal the secrets of the American alliance. His own secretary, Edward Bancroft, was actually a master spy for the British government, reporting Franklin's every move to London in invisible ink. Franklin was well aware that his house was compromised. But instead of tightening security, he chose a brilliant and counterintuitive strategy. He left his papers out in the open and spoke freely about his plans, knowing that the sheer volume of information would confuse the enemy. He realized that in a world of secrets, the best hiding place was in plain sight. He allowed the spies to report his successes to London, using them as an unintentional propaganda machine to demoralize the British ministry and convince them that American independence was inevitable. While crossing the Atlantic, Franklin noticed that the wake of two ships was strangely smooth compared to the choppy sea around them. When he asked the captain why, he was told that the cooks had greasy water from the galley overboard. This sparked a fascination with the calming effects of oil on water, a phenomenon he began to test in ponds across London and even on the open sea. He would carry a hollow bamboo cane filled with oil and pour a small amount onto the waves, watching as a single teaspoon of oil created a mirror-like surface across an entire acre of water. He was the first to realize that oil formed a film only one molecule thick, a discovery that would much later help scientists calculate the actual size of molecules. He even imagined a future where sailors could use large tanks of oil to calm the waters around their ships during a storm, proving once again that his eyes were always searching for the hidden mechanics of nature, even in the middle of a vast and lonely ocean. In 1772, a fierce scientific and political debate erupted in England over the shape of lightning rods. Franklin argued that the rods should be pointed to draw the electrical charge silently from the clouds, while several British scientists insisted they should be blunt or ended in knobs. The debate became a matter of national security when lightning struck a powder magazine at peak. Despite it being protected by rods, King George III, who was increasingly angry with Franklin's politics, ordered that all blunt rods be installed on royal buildings as a direct snub to the American philosopher. Franklin responded with his usual wit, noting that the king could change the laws of the land, but he could not change the laws of nature. He refused to engage in the petty bickering, knowing that his pointed rods were already saving buildings across the globe. The incident showed how even the most objective science could be twisted by the pride of an empire on the verge of losing its most valuable colonies. While Franklin was negotiating the fate of nations in the grand courts of Versailles, he kept a small private printing press in his house at Passy, which he used to produce what he called bagatelles. These were playful, witty, and sometimes scandalous essays intended only for his close circle of friends, most notably the brilliant women of the French salons. He wrote The Ephemeral Tale of the Ephemera, a story about a race of insects that live for only one day, using it as a philosophical meditation on the shortness of human life and the vanity of political ambition. He also wrote a satirical piece called The Trial of the Whistle, where he recounted a childhood mistake of paying too much for a toy, using it as a metaphor for how people spend their lives chasing fame or wealth at too high a cost. These private writings show a side of Franklin that the public never saw. A man who used his craft as a printer to find joy and connection in the middle of a brutal war, proving that he remained an artist at heart even when he was the most powerful diplomat in the world. One of Franklin's most enduring and controversial literary hoaxes was the speech of Polly Baker, which he published anonymously and later admitted to writing during his time in London. The story featured a fictional woman on trial for the 5th time for having a child out of wedlock, who delivers a brilliant and logical defense of her actions. She argued that she was fulfilling the duty of increasing the population while the men who seduced her were promoted to high office instead of being punished. The speech was so convincing that it was debated by lawyers and philosophers across Europe as a real case of legal injustice. Franklin used the character of Polly Baker to challenge the double standards of his time and the hypocrisy of the legal system, showing his deep empathy for the marginalized and his belief that reason should always triumph over ancient and unfair dogmas. In 1784, King Louis XVI appointed Franklin to lead a royal commission to investigate Franz Mesmer, a German doctor who claimed to heal patients through a mysterious force called animal magnetism. Paris was obsessed with Mesmer's elaborate seances, where patients would hold iron rods and fall into trances. Franklin approached the mystery with the cold eye of a scientist, conducting double-blind experiments that were decades ahead of their time. He blindfolded patients and told them they were being magnetized when they were not, and vice versa, proving that the effects were entirely in the patient's imagination. This was the first systematic study of what we now call the placebo effect. Franklin concluded that while Mesmer was a fraud, the power of the human mind to heal itself through belief was a profound discovery, a finding that revolutionized the medical world and saved France from a dangerous and expensive delusion. Among the most secret of Franklin's writings was a letter known as Advice to a Friend on Choosing a Mistress, which was suppressed for over a century due to its shockingly candid and pragmatic advice on romantic relationships. In the letter, he argues that, for a man who does not wish to marry, an older woman is a far better companion than a younger one, noting that they are more discreet, better conversationalists, and more appreciative of affection. He famously and cheekily noted that in the dark all cats are grey, suggesting that physical beauty fades while character and intelligence endure. While the letter was viewed as scandalous by later generations, it was a reflection of Franklin's fundamental honesty about human nature and his refusal to be bound by the stifling moralities of the Victorian age that followed him. He was a man who saw life as it was, not as people wished it to be. As the war drew to a close, Franklin faced intense criticism from his fellow commissioners, John Adams and John Jay, who felt he was too close to the French and too slow in his negotiations. They viewed his constant dining with countesses and his slow pace as a sign of laziness or even betrayal. But Franklin was playing a game they did not understand. He knew that the French were the only reason America was still a nation, and that offending them too early would lead to a British victory. He allowed Adams to play the role of the aggressive and stubborn diplomat while he played the role of the reasonable and grateful friend, using this good cop and bad cop strategy to keep the French money flowing while secretly securing the best possible terms from the British. He understood that in the world of high-stakes power, the man who can control his ego and wait for the perfect moment is the one who ultimately wins the world. By 1785, the news of Franklin's departure from France spread through Paris like a funeral for a living saint. For nearly a decade, he had been the most famous man in the kingdom, a celebrity whose face appeared on more household items than the king himself. His home in Passy had become a shrine to the American cause, a place where Enlightenment philosophy met practical revolution. As he prepared to leave, his neighbors and friends were devastated, including the brilliant women of the salons who had become his surrogate family. He was so weak from kidney stones that he could not endure the jarring motion of a carriage. So Queen Marie Antoinette sent one of her own royal litters, carried by 2 large Spanish mules, to transport him to the coast in comfort. It was a departure fit for a monarch, a testament to the fact that while he had arrived as a humble printer in a fur cap, he was leaving as a titan of the old world whose influence had permanently altered the course of European history. On his way back to America, Franklin's ship stopped at the Harbor of Cows on the Isle of Wight, marking the final time he would ever touch British soil. It was a moment of profound irony and quiet closure, as he was met there by his son William, who had remained a loyalist to the crown throughout the war. Their relationship had been shattered by the Revolution, with the father choosing the Republic and the son choosing the king. They spent several days together in a tense and awkward reunion, trying to settle family business while the ghost of their political betrayal hung between them. Franklin remained cold and distant, unable to fully forgive the son who had stood on the side of the empire that had tried to destroy him. He realized that some bridges once burned can never be rebuilt, and as his ship pulled away from the English coast, he was leaving behind not just a country, but the last remnants of his former life as a subject of the crown. During the 7-week voyage across the Atlantic, Franklin did not rest or wallow in the pain of his illness. Instead, he turned to the ocean itself as his final scientific laboratory. He spent his days recording the temperature of the seawater and observing the behavior of the wind and currents, continuing the work he had begun decades earlier on the mapping of the Gulf Stream. He wrote a long and detailed essay titled Maritime Observations, which included designs for improved sails, waterproof compartments for ship holes, and even a floating anchor to keep vessels stable during storms. He was a man who could not see a problem without trying to engineer a solution, and the vast expanse of the ocean provided him with the perfect canvas for his restless curiosity. He understood that the future of the American nation depended on its mastery of the seas, and he was determined to leave behind a manual for its success. When his ship finally entered the Delaware River in September of 1785, the city of Philadelphia went into a frenzy of celebration. Bells rang out from every steeple, and a massive crowd gathered at the wharves to see the return of the man who had been gone for nearly 10 years. Franklin was carried in a sedan chair through the streets he had once walked as a hungry boy with 3 bread rolls, passing the buildings he had designed and the institutions he had founded. He returned to a house on Market Street that had been expanded by his daughter Sarah in his absence, filled with the books and inventions he had collected in Europe. Yet he found himself a stranger in some ways, as many of his old friends from the junto had died and a new generation of leaders had risen who knew him only as a legend. He was a hero in his own land, but he was also a relic of a passing era, a man who had outlived his contemporaries, but not his usefulness. Almost immediately after his return, the people of Pennsylvania elected Franklin as the president of their Supreme Executive Council, a position equivalent to the governor. Although he was 80 years old and in constant pain, he accepted the role, believing that a citizen must always be ready to serve his community as long as he has the breath to do so. He used his position to stabilize the state's finances and to mediate the bitter political fights between the radical and conservative factions of the government. He refused to take a salary for his work, donating the money to the founding of a new college in Lancaster that would later bear his name. His home became a center of political life, where young leaders like Alexander Hamilton and James Madison would come to seek his advice. He was the bridge between the revolutionary generation and the new constitutional era, proving that even in his twilight years he remained the essential architect of the American experiment. In May of 1787, as the delegates gathered in Philadelphia for the Constitutional Convention, the city was gripped by an oppressive and humid heat wave. The men met in the same assembly room where the Declaration of Independence had been signed 11 years earlier. But now the atmosphere was thick with tension rather than hope. To ensure total secrecy, they ordered the windows nailed shut and the doors locked. Despite the stifling heat, to prevent any word of their arguments from reaching the public. Franklin was the only man in the room who had seen the rise and fall of empires across the world, and he sat in his special library chair, watching as the delegates began to tear each other apart over the nature of power. He realized that the same passion that had won the revolution was now threatening to burn the house down. And he knew that his final task was to keep the room from exploding before a nation could be forged. After weeks of bitter deadlock, where the small states and large states refused to budge on the issue of representation, the convention reached a point of total collapse. The younger delegates were shouting, and the dream of a united America was slipping away. Franklin, usually a man of secular reason, rose to propose something unexpected. He suggested that the convention should begin each day with a prayer, noting that if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without God's notice, it was improbable that an empire could rise without his aid. While the motion was actually rejected because the convention had no funds to pay a chaplain, the gesture served its true purpose. It forced a moment of silence and reflection, reminding the angry men that they were part of something much larger than their own local interests. Franklin was a master of the psychological reset, using the idea of the divine to humble the egos of the mortal men in the room. As the argument over the structure of Congress reached its peak, Franklin delivered a short but profound speech that used the simple language of the printing shop and the carpentry bench. He told the delegates that when a joiner wants to fit two boards together, he must sometimes thin both edges to make a perfect joint. He was telling them that a compromise was not a sign of weakness, but a sign of master craftsmanship. This led to the creation of the Grand Committee, chaired by Franklin himself, which eventually produced the Great Compromise. This plan gave the large states what they wanted in the House, and the small states what they wanted in the Senate. It was a messy, imperfect, and human solution, but it was the only way to save the Union. Franklin understood that a perfect government was an impossible dream, but a functional one was a miracle they could actually achieve. Throughout the convention, many of the wealthier delegates, like Alexander Hamilton, pushed for a government that favored the rich and the well-born, proposing that the president should serve for life and that only landowners should have the right to vote. Franklin, the former apprentice who had never forgotten the smell of boiling animal fat in his father's shop, stood as the firmest defender of the common man. He argued against any property requirements for voting, reminding the room that the poor had fought and died for the revolution just as bravely as the wealthy. He pushed for the impeachment clause, noting that if a president could not be removed legally, the only other option would be assassination. He was the voice of the street in a room full of lawyers and landowners, ensuring that the Constitution would be a document for the people, even if those people did not always have gold in their pockets. On the last day of the convention, after the document had been signed, the delegates gathered for a final dinner at the city tavern. The mood was one of exhaustion and quiet relief, but as the wine flowed, the tension of the summer began to melt away. Franklin looked at Washington, who had sat in the same chair for 4 months, and finally shared his observation about the sun carved on the backrest. He had watched that sun during the darkest moments of the debate, wondering if it was a setting sun marking the end of the American dream, or a rising sun marking a new beginning as he walked out into the cool September air. A woman famously asked him what kind of government they had given the people. He replied with the most famous warning in American history: "A republic, if you can keep it." He knew that the parchment was just paper, and that the real work of building a nation was now in the hands of the citizens he would soon leave behind. In his final years, Franklin lived in a house hidden behind a courtyard on Market Street, a sanctuary of his own design where every room contained a new invention. Because his kidney stones made it agonizing to reach for books on high shelves, he invented a mechanical arm with a wooden hand at the end, controlled by strings that could grip and pull volumes down with precision. He also installed a bathtub shaped like a large shoe made of copper, which allowed him to soak his aching joints while reading his mail. He was a man who refused to be defeated by the limitations of the body, turning his declining health into a series of engineering problems to be solved. His home became a place of pilgrimage for scientists and travelers from across the globe, all coming to see the legendary Dr. Franklin, who, at 83 years old, still spent his days experimenting with the effects of oil on water and the insulation of heat. Franklin spent much of his final time focusing on his grandsons, particularly Benjamin Franklin Batch, whom he had trained as a printer in Paris. He viewed the printing press not just as a business, but as the most powerful weapon for defending the republic he had just helped to build. He set his grandson up with a state-of-the-art shop in Philadelphia, teaching him that a printer must be a guardian of the truth, even when it is unpopular. He also spent hours with his grandson Temple Franklin, tasking him with the monumental job of organizing the thousands of letters and manuscripts that documented his diplomatic triumphs in France. He was carefully curating his own history, knowing that the story of his life would become a manual for future generations of Americans who wanted to rise from nothing. Even as he was confined to his bed, Franklin's mind remained as sharp and biting as it had been when he was silenced. Dogged 60 years earlier, when he heard that Southern politicians were using religious and economic arguments to defend the continuation of the slave trade, he wrote his final great hoax. He published a letter under the name of Sid Hamet, a fictional Algerian pirate who used the exact same logic as the American Southerners to justify the enslavement of Christians in Africa. By flipping the script, he exposed the absurdity and the cruelty of the pro-slavery argument, showing that if their logic was sound, then it could be used to justify any horror against any people. It was a brilliant and devastating piece of political theater, proving that even as his body was failing, he could still use his pen to strike a blow against injustice that echoed throughout the halls of Congress. In February of 1790, Franklin took his final public stand by signing a formal petition to the United States Congress as the president of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society. He called on the federal government to use its power to secure the liberty of the people of America without distinction of color. The petition caused a firestorm in the Capitol, as it was the first time a figure of Franklin's stature had officially demanded the end of slavery. Southern delegates were outraged, accusing the dying man of being a senile interference in their private property rights. Franklin did not flinch. He knew that the revolution would remain unfinished, and the Constitution would remain a hollow promise as long as millions were held in chains. He was forcing the young nation to look in the mirror and see its own greatest failure before he left the stage forever. By March of 1790, a fever began to take hold of Franklin's body as a long-standing lung infection developed into a massive abscess. Every breath became a labor, and every movement brought a wave of pain that even his beloved bathtub could not soothe. He took opium to manage the agony, but remained lucid, continuing to dictate his memoirs and converse with the friends who came to bid him farewell. He told his doctor that he had no fear of death, viewing it with the same scientific calm he had applied to his experiments with electricity. He had lived 84 years of a life that had changed the world, and he was ready for the final revision of his own manuscript. He was a printer who had finished his proof sheet and was waiting for the author to call him home. On the night of April 17, 1790, the house on Market Street became the center of a nation's grief as the man who had tamed the lightning found his own internal spark fading. His daughter Sarah sat by his bed as he struggled against the weight of the abscess in his lungs. And when his doctor suggested he change his position to breathe more icily, Franklin whispered his final recorded words that a dying man can do: "Nothing easy." At 11 o'clock at night, the long and restless journey of the printer's apprentice finally came to an end. The news spread through the dark streets of Philadelphia not by telegraph or wire, but by the sudden and heavy tolling of church bells that woke the city from its sleep. The man who had founded the fire departments, the libraries, and the hospitals was gone. And as the sun rose the next morning, the city he had built felt suddenly hollow and cold. 3 days after his death, Philadelphia witnessed a scene of mourning that had no parallel in the history of the young republic. 20,000 people, nearly half the population of the city, poured into the streets to follow the funeral procession to Christ Church Cemetery. It was a gathering of the people he had loved and represented. The tradesmen with their leather aprons, the scientists with their instruments, and the politicians with their heavy hearts. The bells of every church in the city tolled in unison, and the flags on the ships in the harbor flew at half-mast. As the coffin was lowered into the ground next to his wife Deborah, the people realized that they weren't just burying a man, but the living memory of the revolution itself. He was the last of the great founders who had seen the beginning of the struggle and lived to see the rising sun of the Constitution. The news of Franklin's death took weeks to cross the ocean, but when it reached France, it sparked a wave of grief that eclipsed even the mourning in America. The French National Assembly, led by the orator Mirabeau, declared 3 days of national mourning, an unprecedented honor for a foreign private citizen. Mirabeau delivered a legendary eulogy calling Franklin the sage whom 2 worlds claim, and the man for whom the history of governments and the history of the sciences contend for the honor of having known him. In Paris, where he had been worshipped as the modern Prometheus, his portrait was draped in black and his name was spoken with a reverence usually reserved for saints. The world recognized that a giant had fallen, a man who belonged not to one nation but to the entire human race, proving that the light of reason could build bridges that even oceans and wars could not tear down. When Franklin's will was read, it revealed one last brilliant and calculated gift to the future. He left £1,000 each to the cities of Boston and Philadelphia, but with a condition that showed his mastery of mathematics and his faith in the working man. The money was to be lent at low interest to young married apprentices to help them start their own businesses, and it was not to be fully spent for 200 years. He calculated that through the power of compound interest, which he called the stone that turns lead into gold, the initial gift would grow into millions by the year 1990. He was literally investing in the children of the 18th century to provide for the citizens of the 20th. His trusts eventually funded the Franklin Institute in Philadelphia and the Franklin Institute of Boston, proving that even from the grave he was still the architect of civic improvement and the patron saint of the self-made man. As he had requested in his final years, Franklin was buried under a simple marble slab that bore only his name and the name of his wife. But in the minds of the public, his true epitaph remained the one he had written as a young man comparing himself to an old book. He believed that his body was merely a cover that would eventually be discarded, while his soul and his work would appear once more in a new and more elegant edition. Revised and corrected by the author, he viewed his entire life as a draft that he was constantly improving, a manuscript of experiments and errors that would serve as a guide for others. He left behind a nation that was still in its infancy, but he had given it the tools it needed to grow. The library, the post office, the Constitution, and the belief that any boy with a book and a dream could change the world long after Franklin's death. A dark and puzzling discovery was made beneath his old residence at 7 Craven Street in London. In 1998, during a restoration of the house, builders uncovered a pit in the basement containing over 1,000 human bone fragments, including the remains of several infants and adults. For a moment, the legacy of the great philosopher was clouded by the shadow of a possible crime. But historians soon realized the truth was far more scientific than sinister. Franklin's close friend and housemate, William Hewson, had been running a secret and illegal anatomy school in the house. In an age where the study of human bodies was strictly regulated, Hewson was forced to procure subjects from grave robbers to teach his students the secrets of the human frame. Franklin, the man who wanted to know how everything worked, almost certainly knew about the secret lab beneath his feet. He lived in a house of the dead while he was negotiating the birth of a new nation. A reminder that the Enlightenment was a period of both brilliant light and deep hidden shadows. Franklin never actually finished the story of his life. His famous autobiography, which remains one of the most read books in history, ends abruptly in 1757, leaving his most important years in London and Paris untold by his own pen. The manuscript itself had a journey as chaotic as the Revolution. It was stolen, hidden in a bush during the war, and passed through multiple hands before finally being published in a flawed French translation after his death. It wasn't until the late 19th century that the world finally saw the complete and unedited text of his memoirs. Franklin had written the book as a letter to his son William, hoping to explain how a poor boy could rise to greatness. But the political rift between them meant the intended audience never truly received the message. The missing chapters of his life are a silent testament to the parts of his soul he chose to keep private, leaving us to piece together the man from the letters and memories of others. In the centuries following his death, a myth grew around Franklin's time in Paris, painting him as a legendary womanizer who spent more time in bedrooms than in boardrooms. While Franklin certainly loved the company of intelligent and witty women, the truth was far more complex and professional. The salons of Paris were not just places of flirtation. They were the command centers of French political and intellectual thought. By charming the wives and daughters of the king's ministers, Franklin was gaining access to information and influence that no formal diplomat could reach. His flirtations were a form of soft power, a way to make the American cause personal and emotional for the French elite. He used the language of love to secure the weapons of war, proving that in diplomacy, the heart is often a more effective target than the head. Franklin's influence on the media did not die with him. It became the blueprint for the entire American Fourth Estate. He was the first to realize that a newspaper must be both a profitable business and a public servant, and his style of using humor, pseudonyms, and letters to the editor set the tone for centuries of journalism. His grandson, Benjamin Franklin Batch, took his grandfather's lessons to the extreme, founding the Aurora, a newspaper that became the most vocal and aggressive critic of George Washington and John Adams. Batch was arrested under the Alien and Sedition Acts, dying in prison while defending the freedom of the press that his grandfather had helped to define. The Franklin family remained at the center of the fight for free speech, showing that the ink in their veins was as revolutionary as the blood spilled on the battlefield. We often take the male for granted, But the very concept of a reliable and affordable postal system in America was a Franklin invention. As the first Postmaster General, he treated the delivery of letters like a scientific problem, measuring distances with odometers and establishing night riders to speed up communication between the colonies. He saw the postal service as the nervous system of a democracy, the only way for a vast and diverse people to share ideas and maintain a common identity. His reforms turned the mail from a luxury for the rich into a tool for the masses, and he insisted that newspapers be carried at a low cost to ensure the spread of information. Every time we send a letter or an email today, we are using the infrastructure of the mind that Franklin began to build in the dusty post offices of the 1750s. In the 19th century, as the United States moved toward the Industrial Revolution, the image of Benjamin Franklin underwent a strange and narrow transformation. The complicated, witty, and sometimes scandalous man was polished away by Victorian writers who wanted a safe hero for school children. They focused almost entirely on his proverbs from Poor Richard's Almanac, turning him into a rigid saint of thrift and hard work who never had a fun day in his life. This version of Franklin was used to teach young factory workers to be obedient and frugal, losing the rebellious spirit of the boy who ran away from his brother or the diplomat who flirted with French countesses. He became a caricature on a pedestal, a man of wooden maxims rather than a man of flesh and blood. But beneath this layer of boring respectability, the real Franklin remained, waiting to be rediscovered by a generation that valued his complexity more than his cliches. When the United States Treasury redesigned its currency in the early 20th century, they chose Franklin for the highest denomination in general circulation, the $100 bill. This was the ultimate irony for a man who had once been so poor he arrived in Philadelphia with nothing but a few copper pence. The choice was a tribute to his status as the father of American paper money, as he had been the first to argue that a growing economy needed a flexible currency to survive. But his presence on the bill also turned him into a global symbol of American capitalism, making his face the most recognized portrait in the history of the world. For millions of people who have never read a word of his writing, Franklin is simply the face of wealth and stability, a long way from the ink-stained apprentice who once had to borrow money just to buy a new suit of clothes. Long before the era of Hollywood or the internet, Franklin was the world's first true pop culture icon. He was the first person to understand the power of an image, using his fur cap and simple glasses to create a brand that was recognizable from London to St. Petersburg. In the 1950s and 60s, he became a favorite of animators and storytellers, appearing in everything from Disney's Ben and Me to countless Broadway plays and films. He is often portrayed as the lovable grandfather of the revolution, the one founder who would actually be fun to have a beer with. This enduring popularity comes from his accessibility. Unlike the cold marble of Washington or the intellectual distance of Jefferson, Franklin feels like a modern man who just happened to be born in the 18th century. A man whose wit and curiosity still feel fresh today in the age of the internet. Franklin's legacy has found a new and unexpected home. His belief in the free exchange of information and his refusal to patent his inventions made him a spiritual ancestor to the open source movement and the World Wide Web. He saw the library as a way to link minds across distances, much like the servers that power our digital world today. Scientists and technologists often look to Franklin as the original hacker, a man who took apart the world to see how it worked and then shared the instructions with everyone else. His life was a series of data points, observations, and connections. and he would have been fascinated by a world where the entire sum of human knowledge can be accessed from a device in a pocket. He taught us that information is the currency of freedom, a lesson that is more important now than it was in 1776. As we look back at the nearly 100 chapters of his life, we realize that Franklin's greatest invention was not the lightning rod or the stove, but the concept of the self-made American. He was the first to prove that a person's beginnings do not have to define their end, and that life is a constant process of revision and improvement. His autobiography remains unfinished because his influence is still growing. His ideas are still being tested, and his republic is still a work in progress. He remains the silent partner in every scientific discovery and every civic improvement in the land he helped to create. He was a printer who knew that the story never really ends as long as there is someone left to read the pages and someone brave enough to write the next chapter. The Franklin legacy did not vanish with his death, but lived on through the fiery spirit of his grandson Benjamin Franklin Batch, whom everyone called Lightning Rod Jr. Training under his grandfather in Paris had given him a taste for revolutionary politics and a deep distrust of any government that mirrored the British monarchy. Batch founded the Philadelphia Aurora, a newspaper that became a thorn in the side of the Washington and Adams administrations. He used the same sharp wit he had learnt at the master's feet to argue that the revolution was being betrayed by the new American elite. Though he was arrested for sedition and died young during a yellow fever epidemic, he proved that the Franklin family's commitment to a free and loud press was a permanent part of the American DNA, a bloodline that valued the truth more than the safety of silence, while his grandsons in America carried on his Republican ideals. The descendants of his loyalist son, William Franklin, created a different and more shadowed legacy in England. William had been a man of great talent, serving as the royal governor of New Jersey before the war tore the family apart. But after the Revolution, he lived a lonely life in London, supported by a British pension and haunted by the silence of a father who would not forgive him. The rift between the two men remains one of the great tragedies of the founding era. A reminder that the birth of the United States was a civil war that divided families at their very core. His descendants eventually blended into the British aristocracy, a quiet branch of a family tree that had once produced the man who broke the power of the king, showing that even the greatest of men cannot always mend the hearts of their own children. In the 19th century, the city of Philadelphia honored its most famous citizen by founding the Franklin Institute, a center for science and technology that became one of the world's leading research bodies. The institute was designed to carry on Franklin's mission of making science accessible to the common person, featuring massive libraries and laboratories where inventors could test their ideas. It became the home of the Copley Medal he had once won and a repository for his original electrical machines and printing presses every year. Thousands of children walk through its halls, touching the same sparks that Franklin once tamed, ensuring that his role as an educator and a curious explorer remains a living force in the lives of every new generation of scientists. The scientific world has ensured that Franklin's name will be remembered as long as humanity studies the stars and the atom. In the mid-20th century, scientists proposed the Franklin as a unit of electrical charge to honor his pioneering work in the field. Although it has been largely superseded by the Coulomb in standard measurements, the term remains a symbol of the foundations he laid. Astronomers have named craters on the moon and asteroids after him, and his single fluid theory of electricity remains the conceptual grandfather of the modern understanding of electrons and protons. He is one of The few historical figures whose name is found both on a grocery store receipt and in the complex equations of theoretical physics, proving that his mind truly occupied the entire spectrum of human thought. We have reached the end of the 100 chapters of Benjamin Franklin, but his story remains an open book that continues to be written every day in the streets of Philadelphia and the laboratories of the world. He was a man who contained the contradictions of an entire nation. He was a slave owner who became an abolitionist, a loyalist who became a revolutionary, and a poor boy who became a titan of wealth and fame. He taught us that the greatest power a human being possesses is the ability to change their own mind and to constantly seek a better version of themselves as we close this journey. Remember the boy with the 3 bread rolls and the old man with the lightning rod, for they are the same person, a man who proved that if you can master yourself, you can master the world. He was the first American, and his long shadow is the path we still walk toward the future.